The year, 2008. The magazine, The New Yorker. The story, A Better Brew, the rise of extreme beer. Was this the most important story ever written about craft brewing, Taplines listener? Those who know of what they speak certainly thought so. Tom Assetelli, in his seminal 2013 history, The Audacity of Hops, would herald A Better Brew as, quote, perhaps the most important mainstream magazine article on craft beer since William Least Heat Moon's A Glass of Handmade in Atlantic Monthly 21 years before, close quote. I've never actually read that one, to be honest with you, but I have read this pivotal 10,000-worder from the November 2008 issue of Condé Nast's culture-shaping crown jewel, and today we're going to be talking to the man who put it all together. Burkhard Bilger had been a staff writer at The New Yorker for 7 years when he published A Better Brew, and a staff writer at The New Yorker he remains to this very day. His piece in the late aughts focused on a friendly tension between the mad science of Dogfish head Sam Calagione and the more traditionalist sensibilities of Brooklyn Brewery's Garrett Oliver, who remain titans of the industry even now. But like all great magazine features, Bilger's encompassed so much more. Humanizing dialogue, thematic ruminations, far-flung scenes, and eclectic characters. Its publication and popular reception helped endear the American craft brewing industry to the country's urbane, tone-setting, money-having consumer class on the coasts, and away we went from there. Bilger, a German-American who grew up drinking 3-2 swill in Oklahoma, is also the author of 2 books, including 2023's Fatherland, a well-reviewed memoir about coming to grips with his ancestors' Nazi past. His other book is about noodling for catfish. He also wrote the definitive story on America's tugboat dynasties. The man has range, is what I'm trying to say, people, and he joins Taplines today to revisit the idea, the execution, and the legacy of A Better Brew. This one is for the media heads, the history heads, and the Bilger heads too. It's Burkhard Bilger, it's the rise of extreme beer, it's the New Yorker's gift to craft brewing, and it's all right here, right now, on VinePair's Taplines. Joining us today on Taplines, it's Burkhard Bilger. Burkhard, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Burkhard, where are you joining us from today?
From my house in Brooklyn, New York.
Well, we're glad to have you on the show today. Listeners, for those of you who are not familiar with Burkhard's work, I'm going to fan out a little bit. I'm a fan of yours, Burkhard. I didn't even tell you this in the email, but the piece you're here to discuss today is one of my favorites that you've written, but my absolute favorite came a couple years later when you published Towheads in 2010 for The New Yorker, where you've been a staff writer since 2001. About New York and I guess just sort of dynastic tugboat families that I adored. Your work is excellent. It's incredibly thorough. That's not the story we're here today to discuss, though. We're here to talk about a piece that you published in 2008 about what was then sort of a still nascent, emerging trend, this funky, extreme beer scene that was sort of core to the American craft brewing industry at that time. That story ran in November 2008. It was called A Better Brew, The Rise of Extreme Beer. It was published, like I said, in The New Yorker, where you work as a staff writer. Burkhard, we're going to talk about that story, I think in detail. We're going to deconstruct it. We're going to nerd out as media people sometimes can. But before we do that, can you set the scene for our Taplines listeners about sort of your relationship to beer more broadly at that time, through the early aughts? Like, were you drinking craft beer? Were you drinking wine? Where were you in your drinking journey, maybe?
Well, I mean, it was an interesting journey in a way because, my family were a family of brewers from Germany. My parents moved to the United States in 1962. We're both German, and my father's cousin owned Bilger beer close to the Black Forest, and they were brewing up through the late 70s and then got restarted recently. So it was always something that was kind of in the family we were interested in, but I also grew up in Oklahoma, was born there and grew up there. So beer in Oklahoma was strictly legally set at 3.2% alcohol. So they would actually water down some of the beers
Sure.
that came into Oklahoma. And so I grew up, I felt like it was within the dregs of American beer industry.
The backwaters, yeah.
Absolutely. And there were keg parties in my hometown every weekend, and people would drink, 16 of these beers to get drunk. And it tasted like piss and was not something I was interested in drinking. So I came very late to drinking beer.
Sure.
It was not something I thought was all that good to drink. And then I think I discovered in college, Beck's. It was one of the first real imports along with Heineken that, and I thought it was, wow, this is actually worth my time, worth my imbibing. And I kind of went from there. When I moved to Brooklyn, I remember there was a kind of a New York brewery called Saranac that sold for pretty inexpensively, and I started to drink more and more of that. And it's interesting because by the time I wrote this piece, 2008, the number of breweries in the country had gone from 200 to 1,500 from 1992 to 2008, and I kind of felt like, oh damn, I may have come too late to talk about this trend. Maybe it's already crested or something. Right. And because certainly in Brooklyn by then, the local bodegas and the local small small grocery stores had 10, 15 craft beers for sale. And I was already starting to kind of, in that promiscuous way that craft beer drinkers do, kind of go from label to label and try different things all the time and kind of educating myself.
Yeah. Promiscuous, or as H.L. Mencken, I think, coined the term omnibibulous. They'll drink anything, but never one of the same thing for too long. That would go on in latter days, 13, 15 years later, as we are now in 2023. Omnibibulousness is actually a point of much concern for the craft brewers and the beverage alcohol industry as a whole, because they can't figure out how to get customers to buy their product again and again, because everyone just kind of wants to taste one new thing and then move on to the next thing.
Right.
But in 2008, there's kind of that rising sort of interest in broader flavor ranges that you can maybe access through beer that was not familiar to the American palate in the way that it would become over the course of the next decade, thanks to some of the folks that you covered in that story.
Right.
I want to set the scene a little bit for listeners who I'm 35, so I remember reading this story. I moved to New York in 2010, so I read it. I suppose I was in college when I read your story, because it came out in 2008. I think I read it more or less when you published it. But there was kind of this formative moment for craft beer, and I think your article sort of hit at this really sort of important inflection point, or perhaps the article itself marked an inflection point. Certainly in hindsight, I think that's true. I don't know if I knew it at the time, but I'm not the only one who feels that way. Tom Asitelli, who wrote this book that's sort of a definitive for its time, a history called The Audacity of Hops, that published in 2013. He refers to your article as perhaps, this is a quote, perhaps the most important mainstream magazine article on craft beer since William Lee's Heat Moon's A Glass of Handmade in Atlantic Monthly 21 years before. And 21 years before 2008 is 1987. I was not alive, so forget about Heat Moon's article. As far as I'm concerned, A Better Brew is the most definitive and the most important mainstream magazine article on craft brewing for its era. You described a little bit sort of your beer journey just in broad sketches or in broad strokes, coming from Oklahoma, drinking that near beer, that watery stuff, which just, by the way, not too long ago was finally taken off the books, or like that cap was finally lifted within a few years ago or so.
Wow.
So that is recent. Yeah. Recent history that was still going on. But you encountered Beck's, and that was, I imagine, if you wouldn't mind, we ask here on a history podcast, we ask our guests to date themselves. When were you in college, Burkhard?
That would have been 82 to 86. So okay. I think I remember so vividly. It was in Washington, D.C. I was in a singing group. We were on tour, and I think it would have been 80, '85 when I had my the first Beck's, and I thought, wow, this is good.
And it had the green bottle. It had the foil neck, the label on the neck. You know, it looks good. It's a premium beer. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a well-made German beer. It wasn't anything fancy or unusual. It was just the same thing I'd grown up with, but just better.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right on. And at that time, of course, as you mentioned, Heineken, the Dutch juggernaut, is starting to really find its footing in the United States and is becoming sort of the beer of choice for the emerging yuppie cohort or class, right? This is conspicuous consumption that's at its height at that time. But then, smash cut to Brooklyn, and you're seeing craft beers appear in the bodegas. You're starting to see sort of this explosion, as you mentioned, 200 breweries to about 1,500 in 2008 when you published the piece. You're starting to see the results of that at retail. When did you get the idea of like, hey man, this is actually a thing, I should look into this, maybe I'm going to get my editor on the horn and see if there's a there?
I think I'm trying to remember there was a store in Brooklyn called Beercraft for a short time, and it was run by people who had a broader and broader. I mean, they were doing the first lambics I'd had, and sour ales and all that kind of thing. And I started to get a sense of this thing is really burgeoning. That this isn't just like 5 kinds of mustard. It's going to turn into 1,000 kinds. And it has a potential. So I think that just became clear to me. And I think IPAs were just starting to really emerge as a dominant style at that point. Mm-hmm. And I'd had Dogfish Ale, Dogfish Head 60 Minute, and thought it was terrific. And then I think I remember what the hook for me that was interesting that made me, with these pieces, it's always, this is, I think, a 9,000, 10,000 word piece. Right? So,
I counted it up, not one by one, but I threw it in a word counter. You clocked in at like 9,775. You just short of 10,000 words. Your editor probably had a heart attack.
Right. Well, I mean, these pieces, that's a lot of room. And you have to have multiple threads to carry the story. And there's a lot about beer that's fascinating inherently. Like the history of beer is amazing. Just always going back to Neolithic times and people doing early beers. The Reinheitsgebot. There's so much history that's fun to talk about. The history of American brewing is fascinating. Prohibition and the proliferation of breweries, and then the kind of demise of so many of them, and industrialization. All that stuff was interesting. And then Sam, I had met Sam and talked to him, and I found him to be a really great character. I mean, both very quotable and funny, but also like unexpected, like he looks like a jock and kind of a guzzler, but he's also kind of an artist and a thinker, a philosopher. So, that was great. But the thing that really, for me, made it a story worth telling, or at least was a hook for it, was this idea, the kind of pushback against some of what he was doing. This idea, like when I have quotes with Garrett Oliver, and Garrett and Sam were friends, and I think Garrett makes amazing beers, but there was a
brewmaster of Brooklyn Brewery, by the way, listeners.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Garrett Oliver, wonderful brewer. But there was a certain sense of, wait, are we going too far? Have we taken this anti-Budweiser, anti-thin Pilsner thing to the point where it's become a caricature of itself, or it's doing stuff that's not really beer anymore? Yeah. And I found that an interesting way to frame it. Like, what does it mean to make extreme beer or these new beers?
Did you know, there's been a lot of, frankly, there's been an enormous amount of writing about the craft brewing industry. At this point, of course, it is now closing in on 10,000 breweries. It's a massive $26 billion with a B dollar industry in the United States. So, of course, there's been an enormous amount of, reporting and coverage of it since 2008. Frankly, a lot of it's not been so great. I think it's oftentimes for a mainstream journalist or for a mainstream outlet, there's kind of a surface level hook that they'll take a look at, and then, this is a fun success story. Oh, these zany beers, right? And certainly your story had some of that. But what struck me as this piece, I went back and read it in preparation, for our interview. here on Taplines today. And what struck me in reading this piece is like you didn't actually, and this is, I don't mean to make you blush here, but like you didn't fall into some of those gimmicky pitfalls that I think you could have been forgiven for falling into at that early stage in coverage. That framing that you described, sort of the Garrett Oliver on one side, sort of the polished, suave. That's who he is as a person, by the way, and then also his approach to beer. He publishes the Oxford Companion on beer. He's a historian, a student of the traditions surrounding beer, the history, the ingredients, et cetera, et cetera. Sam Calagione at Dogfish Head on the other side, just as much of a student, just as much of a scholar, but to your point, much more of a sort of wild card in terms of his approach to brewing, his interest in pushing the limits on beer. I mean, the subhead of your piece is the rise of extreme beer. That is embodied in your story by Calagione, of course, who's out there experimenting with Paraguayan hardwoods and, various herbs and oyster shells and minerals that he's putting into his beer. He's known throughout the industry, even at that time, and certainly since, as someone who is more intrigued with the limits of what beer can be. This is a long-winded question. That dynamic or that dichotomy strikes me as more or less like the most prescient, or one of the most prescient ones that would come to define craft brewing over the course of the next decade. And you sort of ferreted it out. Maybe you lucked into it. Maybe you really had a beat on this thing all the way through. How did you find, you found Sam, how did you find the two of them?
How did I find them personally, or talking to them, or
how did you find them personally? And then follow-up question, how did you realize that this was the tension of the piece?
I'm trying to remember. I think Sam actually sent me to Garrett, and I there was a period where I was just casting around trying to find the kind of thought leaders in the industry and brewers who were interesting. And Garrett was certainly an interesting character. I mean, he is this very suave guy, but he wears these outfits and he has this kind of plummy voice and very, he's an interesting figure. And he then sent me, I went to Germany and to Belgium and I talked to brewers there, went to the beer university in Weihenstephan. So I did a pretty wide swoop and then I settled on these two guys. I think part of the reason I thought that framing worked it was that it wasn't a gimmick. It was actually true to the history of beer. I mean, there is this divide between the Reinheitsgebot and the German beers and the Belgian beers, and where we're always more open to lots of different ingredients. And not only that, the kind of idea of beer as a kind of a grab bag that uses bittering agents of all kinds, goes back to like I mentioned King Midas's tomb, where they had like saffron and other kinds of ingredients. So, and I was able to talk to Patrick McGovern, the archaeologist at University of Pennsylvania. So I felt like this kind of extreme, this debate or this dialogue between what whatever session beers versus whatever you call them. It's like that's true to the history of beer. So it allowed me to like both have these characters that embody it, but also like talk about where that all came from.
Did you find yourself persuaded more? You played the piece more or less down the middle, I thought, and it was a really good drawing out, in my opinion, of sort of the two camps, and then of course backdropped against sort of this broader commodity industrial industry business that's going on in the background, the Anheuser-Busch's, the Miller Coors, the Heinekens of the world, who are looking to maybe rip off or then maybe acquire or maybe crush some of the upstart craft breweries. But you played, this tension really well throughout the piece. Did you find yourself at the time persuaded more by one or the other? The extreme beers versus the sort of traditionalists?
Well, I mean, I loved Sam's approach, and I found it very, very kind of, just charming and also exciting. Like it seemed like the right approach for the time. To be perfectly honest, Garrett's beers were more predictably great.
Yep.
There were some of Sam beers that I loved and some of them I really did not like, whereas
Right.
Garrett's beers, consistently Garrett's beers would be good. It wouldn't be as often there would be one that would just be kind of think, oh my God, I've never had anything like that before, but they were so consistent. I think the other thing that played into it at the time was, the American craft brewers just weren't as good then as they are now. There was a lot of people who were still kind of amateurs learning their craft and finding their footing. And Sam, I think, was really important for fostering that adventurous culture. But at the same time, I'd go around for a few years after that and I would try all these beers and often they were terrible.
Bad.
They're unbalanced, right. Weird, like people didn't know what they were doing. It took a while before it was consistently good.
What was the backdrop, or what was the broader sort of marketplace like when you were writing this story? I'm thinking back and in 2006, 2007, I was leading up to this piece because you were doing the reporting. I think you went to GABF in 2007, if I'm not mistaken. So you were doing the reporting on this leading into, obviously, months, maybe years that you were working on this, maybe in the background. But at that time, you said that IPAs are just starting to sort of come on, and that's right. I mean, listeners, it's hard to think of a time when IPA wasn't the dominant craft beer style, but it's true. And not so long ago, it was not this sort of hegemonic, segment, this force that it is now within the category. What were people drinking at that time in the craft beer, sort of broad offerings out there?
It was. There were a lot of pale ales. There were a lot of British style beers. That wasn't so much I felt like a lot of the craft brewers went to Belgium and to British styles as opposed to German styles, because the German styles still felt more old fashioned. They want to differentiate themselves. So you saw a lot of pale ales. You saw a fair amount of, saisons and Belgian ales. Like, Chimay was already something that people would drink, and some of these Trappist ales were
delirium
were
tremens with the opaque bottle.
Tremens.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't yet. It's interesting to me now because I'm always dismayed that I can hardly find brown ales in Brooklyn anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, there'll be 10 kinds of IPAs. No brown ales, a few pilsners and some other oddball things, but it's hard to find the kind of classic styles, and those were still in evidence. Like Smutty Nose Brown Ale. There was some of these beers that were kind of. I think Smutty Nose was pretty well established already, but anyway, they were those were kind of the people went more to those standard styles, but better than the stuff we were used to.
It's funny you bring up brown ales. We've spoken about sort of that moment for craft brewing. I think we talked about it with Sam Calagione when he was on the show. We had him on to talk about 90 Minute, which was for the first Imperial India Pale Ale that was ever registered with the TTB, with the Tax and Trade Bureau, which monitors and approves labels for beer. But his point was that at that time when they rolled out with that, and that would have been like 2000, right around the turn of the century, right? Y2K sort of era. His point was at that time, brown ale was a dominant style. This was, Peach Wicked. I don't know if that rings a bell for you, but brown ale was, like the format for that. And that kind of looked like where, if you wanted to launch a successful brewery in 1997, your investors, if they had any wits about them, they would ask you, well, what's your brown ale? What's your flagship?
Right.
Times have changed, Burkhard.
Yeah.
But
it's it's interesting to me too with the rise of IPAs. It kind of, to me, was paralleled by the rise of ultra dark chocolate and French roast coffee, and there was this
third wave coffee. Sure.
Right, there was this kind of foodie trend, which was focusing in on bitterness and on purity and or intensity, and to some of it was I thought was great. It was kind of like saying, wait a second, this thing that we've been worried about is actually kind of a wonderful taste, and
Right.
it can be a wonderful, but some of it to me was a certain kind of elitist thing, like I will eat even darker chocolate than you will eat. I don't eat 75% or 80%. I want 95% cocoa, or I want the
Sure.
ultra bitter, and it felt like that was, to some degree, that became a runaway train in all those industries for a while. I don't know if it's tapering off now, but in coffee, chocolate, and beer, it all kind of went in that same direction.
It's taken on new sort of veneers, I think, but there's this, I think the accelerationist impulse and the sort of excess for its own sake and performative sort of appetites or advancements in palate, I think that has carried on through. But I want to unpack that a little bit, because I think this is also something that's running through the story that you published in 2008. And I think it, again, would be a very prescient thread that would come to sort of the fore in the next decade, as craft brewing in the United States goes through an enormous boom cycle from whatever, let's call it 2010 to 2017, 2018 or so, and it starts to slow down. And that is sort of this, there's an underlying, and I think you mentioned it in the piece as sort of, or maybe Calagione himself, I forget, it might be a direct quote actually, of like purists versus populists, right? Like there's this idea of, first of all, like, which recipes are, quote unquote good because they're by the book, which ones are, should be given more credence or should be appreciated more because they demonstrate a level of innovation and exploration and that adventurer spirit that Calagione embodied. The other thing that I think is at play there is this concept of of sort of class and conspicuous consumption, which was a phrase that used to be associated with Heineken 20 years prior to your article, but would start to sort of settle on or be a mantle that craft brewing enthusiasts, for better or worse, found themselves saddled with. And when we talk about dark chocolate, or we talk about third wave coffee or fair trade coffee or bean to bar chocolate or craft beer, I think those products, there was an elitism, and continues to be, I think, an elitism to some extent around like what you appreciate versus what the masses appreciate, right? I have a more, my tastes are more refined. I know which types of hops are in this and I can detect them, right? Like, and there's
Right.
there's truth to that, certainly. Like, people have trained palates, like, these are disciplines that people spend their lives sort of mastering. So I don't want to discredit the idea that, there are different hop varietals or there's variation within beers that can and should be detected and understood. But I think that craft beer, around this time starts also to become a venue for expressing like certain, I don't know, for lack of a better term, like predilections or tastes or affectations that become associated with like different socioeconomic classes, with different cohorts. Does that resonate to you at all? Because I might be projecting on your story here. Like, I have the benefit of hindsight, but tell me does that ring a bell to you?
Oh no, it absolutely does. And to be honest, I feel like Sam knew that from the beginning and was kind of playing both sides of that argument from the beginning. I mean, and he would say, I want to be able to command the same respect, the same prices that fine wine can command. I want that for beer. At the same time, he was opening a loose-limbed, like, burgers and beer place, and and he wanted to be the everyman and the populist, and I think that was also honest on his part. He didn't want to just have pinky raised beer tastings all over the country. He wanted both. He wanted to improve American beer, but he also wanted to have beer, this thing which had the potential to be as good as or as expensive as a fine wine. I mean, Jim Koch did, I forget what Koch did, a beer that wish I could remember the name, but Utopia, right? But that was like one of those early, truly fine beers that he wanted to command wine prices for. So I think they were kind of playing both sides of that. And I do feel like overall, it has certainly raised the quality of beer dramatically in this country. So I think it has succeeded on both sides to some degree. But I go to my local bar now in Brooklyn, a couple of ones that I go to, and they have a huge beer list. And honestly, I am completely at sea. I feel like it's become a category for experts in a lot of ways. I don't know where to start. The normal. I don't know all the styles necessarily or the names, so I have to taste like 6 beers before I find one that that's kind of what I want. Whereas I go to Germany, and because my kids live in Berlin now, so I go there a couple times a year, and it's still kind of got this large category, dozens and dozens of solidly well-made beers, and I think we still haven't quite gotten to that point where we have both. We have both the fine wine version and the kind of solid middle ground.
Yeah, my kingdom for a decent Kolsch service, like this. Right. This is all we ask here. All some of us ask here in the United States, and and it's hard. It's still very hard to find. You're right. Like the market has gone in directions unambiguously. I don't think there's any dispute. I think craft brewing's harshest critics, of which I maybe am one, depending on who you ask, would say that the movement, such as it was, the industry, has advanced and raised the floor on the quality and the complexity of American beer and the American beer drinking palate. I don't think that's really up for debate. But your point is well taken, which is that it's also, on the other end of the spectrum, it didn't necessarily push us into sort of those Europhilic or Anglophilic sort of upper reaches that the first generations of American craft brewers had initially started out emulating, as you described. Instead of the beautiful, being able to get a Helles or a Kolsch or just a well-made Pilsner in every town in America. That's not necessarily a guarantee. What you can get, though, Burkhard, is 15 different hazy IPAs that taste like bubblegum or tricks is for kids, So
right.
We opened Pandora's 12-pack, and what came out, maybe what hath we wrought, right?
Right. Well, it's funny for me to go to Oklahoma now in the summers to visit my relatives, and Oklahoma, I'm from Stillwater, Oklahoma, like 50,000 folks. There's a strip there used to sell the most beer per capita in the United States in a city block, and it was all Pabst and like I said, 3.2. And now there are all these crazy small craft breweries in Oklahoma doing all kinds of wacky stuff.
Sure.
And so that's been shocking to me to see like my local cowboy friends, drinking these experimental brews, or what would have passed for that. Yeah.
So I want to go back a little bit to, you mentioned something about Calagione and sort of this idea of, being serious and elevating beer to a level of sort of culinary refinement that wine has long occupied in sort of the American imagination or the culinary imagination of this country. Of course, it also occupies a higher price point, which is attractive from a business sense. Selling a 12-pack or a 6-pack or whatever for $13 is a much different business than selling a bottle of Merlot for $35. And if you can capture those higher price points, especially in 2008, you're sitting pretty as a brewer. So there was both maybe a cultural or sort of an ambitious aspect to pushing into those higher reaches, and then also a business imperative for Calagione. But I think that tension, and this is certainly not just something that Sam was participating in, I think that was in tension at that time with what you described as sort of a fucking rollicking, base course. I don't know, like fecund chaos that a lot of brewers embraced and leaned into. I want to read a quick passage from your piece. There's a quote here, quote, "The king of beers, once served in splendid isolation in many bars, is now surrounded by motley bottles with ridiculous names like Jesters at a Renaissance fair, Skull Splitter, Old Leg Humper, Slam Dunkel, Troll Porter, Moose Drool, Power Tool, Hebrew, and Ale Mary full of taste," close quote. So like, I mean, look, like, this was I think like a puberty for the industry. I think there was a lot of growing up that had yet to happen. But this is, I think, pretty unambiguously, upon reflection, corny, right? Like these are not like real good jokes. These are like goofy little fucking puns, which is fine. But not if you're trying to say, hey, we're the same as wine. Like, take us, it's like the Arrested Development, like, we demand to be taken seriously. It's like, well, I don't know, man. Like, maybe stop marketing Old Leg Humper,
No, I have to say, I kind of love that. I love that phase. It was a little bit like being in the early punk scene in the 70s and 80s, like all those crazy, the Butthole Surfers or whatever,
right.
That was, right. They were like people who wanted to be serious musicians, but also a large part of it was to just give a middle finger to society or to the old ways of doing things, And I think Sam was, his genius was kind of knowing that those two things were not necessarily in conflict. Like that he could be this kind of rock and roll brewer, and do things like, put hot rocks and oysters and blue green algae into his beers, and at the same time, and kind of get a reputation for dangerousness and experimentation that would actually sell, that he would get a following that way. So I think he kind of did that fairly deliberately. He had Andy Warhol was one of his big, and Coco Chanel they were two of his real idols. And they were both people who were both daring, but also like intensely commercial minded, and those were hand in hand.
Did you see a lot of that? I mean, Sam, I think is at the zenith, especially at this point. I mean, he's really in his element. Sam obviously still works in the industry. He's still running Dogfish Head, which was acquired in 2019 by Boston Beer Company, by Jim Cook's, the company that Jim Cook co-founded, and serves as the chair of. But Sam is still working. And like I said, we had him on the pod. He's incredibly charismatic. He's magnetic. He has an obvious passion for this stuff. He knows of what he speaks, et cetera, et cetera. Sam, I would put forth as sort of the paragon of what you're describing. Did you see it represented or reproduced throughout the industry at large when you were reporting this piece?
I did, like I said, I did a fair amount of traveling, and so I saw all kinds of types. I went to the Orval factory or Orval monastery in Belgium, and it was an interesting scene there because it was like it's ostensibly done by Trappist monk, but there's one very professional brewer with a very professional brewing outfit in the middle of the old castle doing his thing. And once a year the monks get together and shoot a video of them putting the Orval bottles in paper, but really that's their only connection to this beer whatsoever. So I had those guys, and then this is embarrassing, but Vinny from Russian River Brewing, he was amazing. I hung out with those guys, and of course, you always have to nod to the West Coast as being the real progenitor for so much of this, and the early, so much early stuff came from there.
Certainly,
and they were. A lot of the other brewers, they were all kind of fun to be around. I think what was different about Sam was that he was just so articulate, and he kind of both was having fun with it, but he had a philosophy that he could articulate and explain why he was doing what he was doing. So often, I think with other people, they were like chefs. Chefs aren't necessarily the most well-spoken folks. Yeah. But they have an amazing intuition for how tastes go together, and they love their craft, but they're not necessarily the best thinkers about it.
Well, that was always the funniest thing about, you probably remember this because you lived through it just like I did. There was a period, and again, this is last decade, so a little bit after you wrote this story in 2008, but there was a real groundswell, seemingly advanced purely by publicists and sort of glossy magazine writers, the New Yorker notwithstanding, not exempt from what I'm about to say, but that we're trying to advance this idea that like chefs are the new rock stars. Do you remember that slogan being thrown around a ton, right? Like, and there was this idea like, oh, like they're the new rock. It's like, well, kinda, because there's this enormous appetite, cultural appetite for better food experiences, better restaurant experiences, provenance and sourcing and ingredients and whatever. But also, like, being a rock star, there are, sort of cultural implications there that many chefs had no interest in participating in. They just wanted to be on the line. They didn't want to be fucking talking to cameras all the time. Like, brewers faced some of that as well. There was this idea like, oh, brewers are the new rock stars. Craft breweries are where, sort of like everything is headed culinarily. That's where the gravity is right now. It really felt like that. And I think to some extent it was true and borne out in the sales figures as craft brewing was growing double-digit percentage points year over year throughout most of last decade. But that doesn't mean necessarily that everyone is as charismatic and articulate and electric as the Sam Calagione in the industry, right? Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that the chef equivalent of Sam was Anthony Bourdain, and he was, and instructively, he had been a chef, but he kind of dropped out of that, he became more of a media figure and talked from the inside about what it was like. But then he became more of an explainer and less of a chef himself. And certainly I've profiled a number of chefs for the New Yorker over the years. And most of them are, perfectionists. They're more like, I don't know, the really high end chefs are more like scientists than they are like public figures or entertainers. There are people who are thinking deeply about ingredients, and also, it's such a high stress occupation. But they're not necessarily thinkers on the level of the industry and what the kind of cultural stuff that Sam will talk about or Anthony Bourdain would talk about.
Yeah. Let's switch gears for a second, Burkhard. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the impact of this story and your thought process and your editor's thought process as you're putting it together. So, like we said, A Better Brew publishes November 2008, excuse me. By that point, we're in the thick of the recession. Lehman Brothers went belly up like 2 months earlier. So you got this nice, fun piece about this, this zany beer industry. And people are like, do we have a financial system anymore? I don't know. So we've got, so the story hits. When you were putting it together, did you have a sense for, like, did you set out to write the definitive story? I guess is a good way of asking that.
In a way, I mean, I'm kind of an old style New Yorker writer. I don't tend to do super newsy stuff. I do kind of oddball stories and obsessives and I try to always write the definitive story, I guess is my answer. I mean, I thought in this case, I was shocked that the New Yorker had never published a beer piece. We had published innumerable pieces on wine. We'd never published a beer piece. And so I thought, wow, there is so much ground to cover here. And it's all fascinating.
Yeah.
Like, it's all fascinating. Like, like I said, the early prehistorical stuff about how beer arose and why it was different from the way wine arose, the kind of chemistry of it, how it's made, how it's, and the laws that were passed, all this stuff to me was just so interesting. And I thought, this is an opportunity to do the definitive piece. And I kind of went about it thinking I want this to be the beer piece to end all beer pieces. And that was certainly my hope.
What about putting like the New Yorkers, and this is, behind the curtain here. I've never written for the New Yorker. I'm assuming most of our audience has never written for the New Yorker. When you're thinking about putting a piece like this together, obviously the imprimatur of the New Yorker is quite significant. It carries a lot of weight. It is for better or worse, it's a cultural bastion, and what it says matters, and that's in no small part due to the hard work of writers, of journalists such as yourself. But do you think about going into a story like this we're going to put craft beer on a map in a way that it never has been before. This was a fringe thing, or it was sort of a subcultural thing, and we're about to put this squarely in the mainstream zeitgeist. Does that cross your mind?
I think in a way that the timing on this was perfect, in a sense that I wasn't really defining this movement, or I wasn't really kind of saying this, we need to make a movement. The movement existed. I was catching it just as it was really on the rise. And it was all, I think there were a lot of people I knew were already drinking craft beer. I think what hadn't happened was this sense, this kind of broader cultural recognition that, oh, damn, there's this thing happening now. And now this sense of, oh, I noticed there's a lot more beers. Like it's part of a whole cultural history. It's a part of a whole American history. That hadn't happened. And I think for me, doing it in the New Yorker, where I knew there were a lot of people who would appreciate those details, mattered a lot. I wanted to kind of set this thing in context and say, look, this isn't just a bunch of nutty guys experimenting with beer and putting funny names on the labels. This is part of this whole long arc of American craft brew history, and we're kind of finally coming around to what we once had, and I thought that story would appeal to the New Yorkers, and it would start to, as to some degree, it legitimizes the category, and it says, look, there's more to it than we thought, but it's also just kind of acknowledging what's already there.
Mm-hmm. I'll say, as I think you're being modest, I'll say that when the New Yorker did this story, I think it got a lot easier for a lot of working journalists, myself being one, who came along, 3-4 years later, to pitch more serious stories about craft beer and to do maybe a little bit longer form stuff that's a little bit more thoughtful about the space. Someone has to go first. And certainly you're not the only writer, and the New Yorker isn't the only publication, but this was, I think, a real watershed moment that maybe gave a little bit of cover or sort of opened the floodgates a little bit more to, craft brewing as a prism through which to discuss larger cultural, historical, political, themes that are sort of unfolding in the country. So I think you're being a little bit modest, Burkhard, but we'll let you.
Well, I mean,
you're welcome to. I'll brag for you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I have to say, one thing I loved about the response to the piece was it wasn't just, I got a lot of response to people saying, "Oh, this is fascinating," or "You think you usually get for a story," but I also got people, saying, I was on a train reading this article and I realized I'm quit my job. I'm going to start a brewery. I got, there are a lot of people who I think might have in the back of their minds thought about getting into beer, and didn't realize how deep and rich a field it is. One of the things I loved going to the beer university in Weihenstephan in Germany was realizing, man, if I hadn't been a writer, I might have been a brewer. Because it's everything. You're a cook, you're a biochemist, you're a marketing person, you're a fermenter. You're doing things on all these different levels, and just the appeal of that and being connected to that history, I think came through in the story, and I think that probably did inspire some folks, which was great.
Yeah, I bet it did. And I mean, this is still, like I said, I mentioned the recession just moments ago. This was a point where a lot of people either, if they lost their jobs, maybe that's one thing, or they just see sort of, man, everything is so fleeting and so fluid right now and chaotic. I need to be doing something that I care about more because this job could be gone tomorrow. And you see, coming out of the recession in 2008, 2009, 2010, you see craft brewing continue to grow, even at a time when, the economy writ large is scrambling for stability, is scrambling for, steady sources of capital. So I think, if they read the Burkhard Bilger 10,000 worder in the New Yorker in November 2008, and they quit their job on the train, they call their boss and say, "I'm out of here. I'm going to go brew brown ale." Maybe that's one person, but maybe it's representative of a sort of broader attitude that I think has some echoes to what we experienced throughout the pandemic, where like people are like, gosh, what am I doing here? Like, this doesn't matter. Like, I want to go do something that matters. Right. So I can understand why people might have reacted that way, especially in 2008, when there's only 1,500 brewers and there are still major American cities with only one or two craft breweries. The canvas is almost blank. It feels like opportunity, right?
Yeah. That's what I saw in Oklahoma that was so great. Because it's always been kind of a one economy, one business economy. It's all oil there, and small town Oklahoma, like where I grew up, or mid-sized cities, there just only so many ways to make a living. It always felt, and suddenly you're realizing, oh damn, like everybody drinks beer in this state.
Yeah.
And not everybody naturally loves this beer we're drinking. There is a market here. And to see all these kind of scruffy local breweries, there are like 2 or 3 brew pubs in my hometown now. To see that happen was really gratifying.
Yeah. Oh, I bet. And I think, again, for all the criticism and sort of like harder reporting that I do or try to do on the craft brewing industry, I think there's sort of a core truth that it has been an enormous economic engine for places like a Stillwater, Oklahoma, that maybe did not have necessarily like these opportunities for like light manufacturing, which is basically what brewing is, right? Like no one's opening, small 50 worker plants in whatever this small city somewhere throughout the country in 2008. But breweries are starting to open, and breweries continue to open throughout the course of the decade that would follow. And even today in 2023, even though growth is basically flat in the craft brewing industry, or maybe a little bit down, depending on how you slice it, openings still outpace closures. People are still see opportunity in this business. We're closing in on 10,000 breweries in the country, and there are still niches that people feel that they can go out and that they can fill in the way that, in 2008, earlier, when you joined up with Calagione and with Oliver and with the rest of the folks that you talk about in your story, in the way that they found those niches back then. So it's still happening. Yeah. It's certainly different, but in terms of, sort of the pace at which it's happening, but that spirit is still there. And I think that appetite for innovation and being able to sort of, just experiment and have fun with it, I think is something that craft brewing as an industry would do well to reconnect with more, rather than, sort of push towards the hard seltzer commodification sort of direction that I think the rest of the beverage alcohol industry is heading. So, yeah. That's just, that's not even a question. That's just a reflection.
You mentioned the financial crisis. That's always been true with beer, right? That, or with alcohol, that in hard times people drink. So
yes.
It's like
when things are good, people drink. When things are bad, people drink.
Anyway.
Beer is famously recession-proof. Beverage alcohol, more or less recession-proof. Of course, the luxury end of things, people are not buying bottles of Dom Perignon, of Courvoisier necessarily, of nice liquor when there's a recession, but they are consistently buying beer, and they're consistently buying value-priced wine, and they're consistently buying spirits, which is why it's such an attractive investment and always has been. That's more at the industrial side of the scale. There are not that many publicly traded craft brewers, but your point is well taken. Burkhard, we've gone the distance here. We're closing in on an hour. I want to call this episode the Ballad of Old Leg Humper, but I'm not going to, because we've talked about so many more interesting and fascinating and frankly deeper topics than I think that name would encapsulate. But I do want you to put on the thought experiment cap here at Taplines and sort of think about, or look back on where the beer industry has gone since you wrote the article. You're not really someone, you as you said, you told me before we got on, you haven't necessarily kept up on reporting on the industry, and why would you? That's not really your main beat, but you obviously still drink beer. You still pay attention to what you see in the bars, in the liquor stores, in the bodegas. You're a consumer of beer here in the American drinking landscape. Reflect a little bit for me on, in 2008, you see one version of what craft brewing can be, or you see maybe a lot of possibilities for where it can go. In 2023, it has gone to some of those places. It has not gone, has not taken some of those other paths. Reflect for me a little bit on how things have taken shape in ways you maybe expected, or maybe didn't in the intervening 15 years for the craft brewing industry.
Well, I mean, on the positive side, I think it's been amazing to see the rise in ability that I mentioned earlier. That back then it was a pretty hit or miss category. You never knew what you were going to get, and I feel like that's just not true anymore. I mean, I go almost anywhere I try a beer, it will be at least well made. It will be. I mean, there's still flops, but in general, you have a sense of the real skill in the industry, which is exciting and great. I think I wouldn't have anticipated the kind of monolith of the IPA overtake. At the time, Sam had already done 90-minute IPA. He'd already done 120-minute IPA, which was 12% alcohol. And it felt a little bit like he was sketching out the extremes, but I don't think even he would have guessed that the IPA would become the absolute norm in so many craft brewing establishments. And that to me is a bit of a shame. I mean, I kind of, like I said earlier, I kind of wish there were some of the more traditional normal styles would still be around more often, like a straight ahead brown ale or a Kolsch, all those kind of things were. But I feel like that's still. I don't think we've yet gotten to the point that wine is at where there's a multiplicity of wines, but it's a fairly kind of graspable, understandable set of types, and you kind of know what you're getting, and there are different flavors within it. I kind of feel like the beer industry is still has gone in this strangely lopsided way where there's this enormous juggernaut of IPA and there's a million little styles on the side, and that kind of the kind of more traditional middle is a little bit underserved. I don't think I would have expected that. I don't know what Sam would have thought at the time, or Garrett. I mean, I think in a way Garrett, what Garrett was doing, I wish there was more of Garrett Oliver in the industry right now, more of, and Steve Hindy, who owned the business back there with Tom Potter. I mean, those guys, they made, I think, exciting beers, but also readily definable ones that fell in with tradition, and you knew what you were getting. I wish there was a little more of that middle still around, but hey, I'll take what I got. I think it's been an exciting 20 years or 15 years.
Me too. I understand. I think I'm basically exactly with you on that. Of course, my beer journey is not quite as long and varied as yours has been, but I'm basically with you there, right? Like, I think we've come a tremendous way, but we have a ways to go. And man, I guess I'm going to start a change.org brown ale petition. I'll send it to you after we're done with the episode. Like I said, listeners, there are dozens of us. We demand brown ale at a fair price. Look out for the petition in your inboxes. It'll be signed by Dave Infante and Burkhard Bilger. Burkhard, thank you so much for joining today. It was a pleasure talking to you, and we hope to have you back sometime soon.
That was a good time. Good talking to you.
Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sciarrino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes, you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.